The tomb of King Tut, filled with gold and jewels, it is famous around the world. But there is a perplexing mystery here. Much of what was found in the tomb doesn't belong to Tut. Whose was it, and how did it get here? The Egypt detectives are on the case. Egypt detectives Dominic Montserrat and Miriam Cook are taking a fresh look at the most famous tomb of all.
It's been called the greatest archaeological discovery of the 20th century, and millions of people have seen it worldwide, but there's still an awful lot that we don't understand about Tutankhamun's tomb.
It's remarkable that so little analysis has been done on the contents of the tomb.
Yeah, it's as though archaeologists have been so overwhelmed with the sheer amount of material that they've just described it rather than looking at it in any detail. It's possible that there might be something really odd about Tutankhamun's tomb.
They start their investigation in modern Luxor, on the Nile River. More than 3,000 years ago, this was Egypt's southern capital, Thebes. This was the religious center of ancient Egypt. It was dominated by the great temple of Karnak, devoted to the worship of the god Amun. Tut's full name, Tutankhamun, actually means living image of Amun. To ancient Egyptians, he was a god. Tut became king when he was just 10 years old and died suddenly when he was only 20. Today, he is the most celebrated ancient Egyptian of all time, but his fame was the result of an historical accident. When he died, Tut's body was taken from Thebes across the Nile. For Egyptians, the West Bank was the realm of the dead. Here in the Valley of the Kings, the Egyptians buried their royalty. The tombs were large and filled with glorious artifacts. By the time the tombs were discovered by modern-day researchers, most had been plundered, but one somehow was missed: the tomb of King Tut. Inside was a dazzling array of everyday objects and golden treasures. Because gold never tarnished, the Egyptians hoped it would give immortality to the dead. But beyond the gold and glitter, there are many unanswered questions. The Egypt detectives are following the lead of the man who found the tomb, Howard Carter. He knew immediately that there was something very strange about what he had discovered. Carter found Tut's tomb in 1922 after a long and frustrating search in the Valley of the Kings. It was like walking into a time machine. The tomb had not been touched for more than 3,000 years. The contents were virtually intact. Carter found treasure after treasure: chariots, huge gold-encrusted sarcophagi, exquisite thrones and chairs. There was even a collection of miniature boats. It was breathtaking. The discovery made Tut a star. Ruling for only 10 years, he had largely been left out of Egyptian history. With the help of Howard Carter, he became famous. Carter's notebooks, though, reveal he was puzzled by what he found.
Carter recorded his discovery of the tomb in 1922 in great detail. These notebooks are a real goldmine. It's only now that we're beginning to fully realize how insightful he was.
Because so few untouched tombs have been found in Egypt, it's hard to know if Tut's was typical or not. What the detectives do know is that tombs were usually prepared while the pharaoh was still alive. The Egypt detectives knew this would give builders time to create large, elaborate chambers. Once built, Egyptian religion required that personal items be buried along with the dead king. These would ensure that he had everything he needed in the afterlife. Whoever became pharaoh next had to make sure everything was done right. No stage of the burial ritual could be ignored. But Howard Carter saw that Tutankhamun was buried with other people's treasures.
He noticed how small and how peculiarly laid out the tomb was in relation to other kings' tombs in the Valley of the Kings. He also noticed a strange pile of debris at the foot of the great sarcophagus, which suggested that the coffins inside had been cut down.
What was going on? It seemed as if the coffins had been made for someone else, then adapted for Tut. But that was against the very strict rules of proper Egyptian burial. Carter's conclusion was radical.
All in all, Carter thought, Tutankhamun had been buried with a job lot of other people's stuff.
But the question remains, why? Carter could never solve the mystery, and few have followed up until now. The detectives consult with Nicholas Reeves, an expert who may have the answer. King Tut's tomb, crammed with glorious treasures. But it turns out, most of them aren't his. The Egypt detectives are picking up a case that Howard Carter, the man who found Tut's tomb, was never able to crack.
He obviously went through all the pieces in the tomb. He looked at everything. He catalogued most of it. I don't think he really fully grasped the implications of all of this. And I really don't think anybody has done.
But why was such an explosive discovery never followed up?
I think a lot of professional Egyptologists have considered Tutankhamun's tomb to be rather vulgar, populist, therefore not really worthy of serious consideration. Just a glamorous assemblage of material with no historical implications or ramifications.
Reeves decided to go where no one else had. He believed that Carter was right. There was something very odd about Tut's burial.
In the mid-1990s, I started going through the material again and noticed that there was, in fact, something more to be said about Tutankhamun's tomb.
Right.
If you look closely at that material, you'll see that something like 80% of that material was never made with Tutankhamun in mind. It was second-hand material which Tutankhamun had taken over for his own use.
It means that some of the most famous artifacts in Tut's tomb aren't his. What we thought we knew is wrong.
It's the quintessential object of Tutankhamun. You look at it closely, though. I think that the mask was never made for Tutankhamun at all. I think it was reused for Tutankhamun. The reason I say that is because if you look behind, underneath the back of the mask, as it's now displayed in the Cairo Museum, you see that there is a solder mark running down the side of the face, and along the neck, and up and across. I think the face has been replaced. I think that that mask was originally made for another king and reused for Tutankhamun.
Had the mask been stolen? Misplaced? The mystery deepened. Egypt detectives Miriam Cook and Dominic Montserrat are trying to crack the case of King Tut's tomb. The young king was buried in a strangely small tomb with a lot of other people's possessions. Even his famous golden mask may not have been his. It's a curious claim. Nick Reeves has been studying the case closely.
I think the face has been replaced. I think that that mask was originally made for another king and reused for Tutankhamun.
My own feeling is that the mask was originally made for Akhenaten.
What was going on? Akhenaten was Tut's father and Egypt's most controversial ruler. He had unleashed a revolution by rejecting Egypt's old gods. But Tut and those who followed had rejected Akhenaten and all he stood for. The revolution died. So why would Tut be buried beneath the mask of his notorious father?
All good detective stories begin with a dark secret in the past. And in this case, all the leads take us back to the city of Amarna.
Amarna. This was Tut's dark secret. The city his father had built in the desert. The city that was supposed to be Egypt's new capital. This is where Tut is thought to have been born. During his childhood, Egypt was in chaos. A religious revolution was underway, driven by Tut's father. Akhenaten dismissed all of the old gods of Egypt. He replaced them with a single god, Aten, represented by the sun disk. Amarna would have been a city of intrigue. Did anything happen here that led to Tut's strange burial? The detectives compare notes.
Tutankhamun is really pretty important in terms of his family background.
Go on.
Well, we don't know for sure who his mother was, but she may have been Nefertiti, the wife of the pharaoh Akhenaten, who threw Egypt into turmoil with his religious reforms.
And overturned the old gods, including Amun, and moved the whole capital city from Thebes down to this new site at Amarna.
Right, and that's where Tutankhamun is born, not under that name, but as Tutankhaten, with a name honouring his father's god, the Aten, or deified sun disk.
And then Akhenaten dies, and within a few years, Tutankhaten becomes Tutankhamun.
Amun, exactly. And I think the whole mystery of Tutankhamun's burial lies in that change of name.
Changing his name meant accepting the old god Amun and rejecting Aten, the god of his father. It was a slap in the face, but Tut was only getting started. The clues suggest Tut wanted to completely overturn his father's revolution. The detectives looked for more evidence at the Luxor temple. Built by Tut's grandfather, it was dedicated to the god Amun, the old god. On these walls, there are images of Tut as king. They show him doing something that would have made his father roll over in his grave.
There you are.
This corner of the temple is full of images of Tutankhamun. They're quite damaged, though.
Yeah, they're not very clear. Although I can make out that it's Tutankhamun. And he's wearing the horns of Amun.
Isn't that extraordinary?
By wearing the horns of Amun, Tut was clearly rejecting everything his father stood for. His decision couldn't be any clearer.
But there's Tutankhamun again. He's burning incense. And that's Amun, the
Yes.
god his father turned his back on.
They're returning to the old gods. Tutankhamun's changing Egypt now.
But if Tut rejected his father so utterly, what was his father's mask doing in his tomb? The case is getting more complicated. The mask isn't the only relic in Tut's tomb that can be tied to his father.
If we look closely at this throne here, we can see an Aten or a sun disk on its back. Now, this was a symbol of a failed religious experiment that was over when Tutankhamun was a baby.
The detectives need to head back to the Valley of the Kings. Reeves believes the answer is there. King Tut, the most famous of the ancient Egyptians, but his tomb is filled with objects that don't belong to him. The Egypt detectives are in the Valley of the Kings, trying to solve this strange case.
It's a whodunit. We need to discover who was in power when Tutankhamun died, because they would have been the people organising his burial.
Well, we've got an important clue right here.
Well, what is it?
It was used to store the leftovers from Tutankhamun's burials.
The detectives find torn strips of linen used in the mummification process. They also find pieces of pottery.
And amongst them were jars that had the funeral meals of the mourners.
The jars, combined with other evidence, reveal who was at Tut's burial. Dominic focuses on two specific names.
First of all, there's Ankhesenamun, the widow, because you always suspect the widow first in a detective story. And then there's Ai, an older man who's been around the centres of power for a long time, since before Tutankhamun was even born.
Tut was only 20 when he died. He had been king since he was 10. Was he really in charge of Egypt? Or were these two figures calling the shots? What were they up to when Tut died? The detectives returned to Tut's tomb to find out. It's been more than 80 years since Howard Carter first found Tut's tomb and astounded the world. The investigation of its strange artifacts has brought the detectives full circle. The answers they seek must be here.
So we're right at the heart of the mystery here. This is Tutankhamun's sarcophagus, and his body is still inside here. And we need to find out what was happening at his burial 3,300 years ago.
Well, there's a clue in this part of the wall painting. Here's Tutankhamun, and he's receiving the opening of the mouth ceremony. It's a ceremony which will enable him to speak words in the next world and so be reborn. But look who's performing it for him. It's Ai.
Ai was a long-time member of the court who was closely tied to Tut's father. Why was he performing such an important ceremony?
But that's usually done by the son of the dead person. So Ai is placing himself in the role of successor.
Well, it's more than that. This cartouche shows that he's already pharaoh. That's the prerogative of kings. And we know from other evidence that by this time he's already married Tutankhamun's widow, Ankhesenamun. Here she is.
So we have our two suspects right here, Ai and the widow of Tutankhamun.
Did the odd objects in Tut's tomb have something to do with the transition in power?
Well, we know that Tutankhamun was buried with a strange collection of his forebears' possessions relating to the failed religious experiment at Amarna.
And we also know that his widow, Ankhesenamun, and Ai, her new husband and the new pharaoh, are organising this rather odd burial.
So we have our two suspects, but now we need a motive.
Why would Tut's widow and Ai put what were essentially stolen goods into Tut's tomb? The detectives go back to Amarna. This is the city where Tut was born, the city where his father's empire collapsed. Ai too once lived here. The detectives soon discover that Ai thought he might die here as well. This is the tomb Ai began to build, but never finished. It tells us a lot about him. While the religious revolution of Tut's father was in full force, Ai embraced it. His loyalty to Tut's father is engraved on the walls of his would-be tomb. These are images of the rebel pharaoh Akhenaten and the new god Aten. But when Akhenaten died and the revolution failed, Ai changed his ways. He stopped building his tomb. The ideas it expressed were suddenly political suicide. But if Ai was such a political survivor, why would he bury King Tut with remnants of the failed revolution? What was going on? According to Egypt expert Nick Reeves, it's almost certainly connected with the fact that Tut died quite suddenly. For Ai, it was a huge problem. He wanted to rule Egypt, but he had to bury Tut first. It was his job. But Tut's unexpected death caught him without a plan. These events could explain the strange collection of objects in Tut's tomb.
Well, when you think about the position that Ai must have found himself in, he wanted to succeed. And in order to succeed to the throne, an Egyptian king has to prepare for his predecessor, proper Egyptian burial. The difficulty was that Tutankhamun had died young and presumably unexpectedly. I suppose we can assume that there wasn't really time to prepare anything. And so it came as a shock, and I was faced with a problem.
Having to act quickly, Ai didn't have time to build a huge tomb for Tut, so he settled on small, but well-crafted. Ai likely adapted a tomb that had already been dug, but for a lesser person than a king. But what about filling the tomb? Where would he find the artifacts Tut needed to make the journey to the afterlife?
What does Ai do to solve the problem that he's faced with of having to give Tutankhamun an effective royal burial?
Well, I think he was lucky because he was faced with this problem at the time when they decided already to dismantle the royal tomb at Amarna and ship all that material back to Thebes.
Tut's father and family had originally been buried back at Amarna, but when the city was abandoned, the mummies and burial goods were brought back. It was a lucky break for I.
What they did was to bring all the burial equipment back to Thebes, put it in a pile. From this pile, they cherry-picked the pieces they needed for Tutankhamun's burial. And what was left over, was then redivided out amongst the people who did originally belong to.
At 20 years old, Tut was buried with leftovers. The treasures of his father were transferred to him. Quickly, I was able to do his duty. The son, who betrayed the revolution of his father, was now surrounded by his memory. Separate in life, the two were joined in death.
We found out that Tutankhamun was buried with other people's possessions because there wasn't any time to manufacture his own.
These treasures would have been destroyed if they hadn't have been kept safe in Tutankhamun's tomb.
Tut reigned for only 10 years. After his death, his name, like that of his father, disappeared from history. If Howard Carter had not made his remarkable discovery, Tut would have been unknown. Now, though, he will never be forgotten. A tale of betrayal and power. A story of sudden death that casts fresh light on an extraordinary period in Egyptian history.